Hi, and welcome to another episode of Your Perfect Palette. Today we're going to talk about greens. So, without getting into too much pre description or anything, let's just get right in. There's, I think, a lot to talk about as far as greens are concerned. So, here we have a color wheel. This is the area that we are going to be talking about. And I'm going to be talking about a number of different paints, some single pigment greens, but one of the things that we will run into quite commonly are convenience mixture greens. Sap green and Hooker's green are two that come to mind. While there are other single pigment greens like the phthalo greens and Iridian, others as well, um, Sap and Hookers tend to be pretty common convenience greens that painters will have in their palettes, and there's a good reason for that, which hopefully see shortly. So yeah, we're going to be talking about the greens in this area here, brighter, I know higher chroma and duller greens as well. So over and look at color map here. So again, this is a lovely resource put together by Daniel Smith. It's the CIE Lab color map. And you can see a whole whack of colors all over here. These are, well, I think, almost all of their paints. Maybe there are some that aren't in here. But as you can see, it's arranged similar to a color wheel. We have our yellows going around into our kind of warm greens, into our cool blue leaning greens, into a blues, down into our violets, around in our blue purple leaning reds, our warmer reds, oranges, back all the way around to yellows again. We're going to be looking in here at all these greens. Now, Daniel Smith has a lot of green. And I think that for most people, when you're getting started out in watercolor, what I know best. So you're going to encounter, would say, phthalo greens, either a yellow shade or more commonly a phthalo green blue shade. Viridian is something that you will encounter as well. And then sap green and Hooker's green are two of the more common convenience greens. So we're going to be taking a look at those for sure. And then I'm going to show you a few additional green paints, cover a couple other purposes, I guess is the best word. So if we look here, you can see that there are a ton, and Daniel Smith has a ton of different greens. Now, the main problem for a lot of greens, if you have a basic split primary palette where you've got two yellows, two reds, two blues, you can mix an awful lot of greens with just those paints. And general preference of a lot of painters is to mix your greens. I do a little bit of both. I will mix my greens, using combinations of primaries, sometimes a little bit of my earth colors as well, earth yellow or earth orange, which I did speak about in another episode. And I will also use some convenience greens. Now, with my primary pigments, I tend to keep a pairing of a warm and a cool. And I do the same thing with greens. I actually have a couple of greens in my palette. One leans towards the yellow, and the other leans towards the blue. And that gives me a little bit of variety in how I'm going to go about mixing, different greens should I wish to do so. Now, one common misconception that I see a lot with painters that are getting started, I mean, I know I did it, is, not really understanding what the green is you could be looking at, right? Say, for example, you might just take some green out of your tube or out of a half pan or full pan, and you just use it on its own and paint trees, paint grass, paint whatever, and then you wonder why your painting looks odd or whatnot. Often because those greens right out of the tube aren't very natural. They're sometimes too bright. Greens that we see in nature tend to be a lot duller than we think. So often they need to be mixed, even if you have a green pigment. So what we see here with all these greens, you can see some very yellow greens, and then we see some very bright high chroma greens, right? So these tend to be the ones that get used. Here is our phthalo green blue shade. Here is our phthalo green yellow shade. And you can see these are very high chroma, bright pigments. But even when we come in a little bit, actually we'll skip that one. Well, here, Viridian, I don't get a swatch list there, but this can actually be quite bright, and it's very blue. It's a very pretty green, but it doesn't look very natural. So when you see pigments like sap green getting used or Hooker's green, just refresh this here for some reason. There we go. That looks much better. So you see our phthalo green, very bright. Phthalo yellow green, very bright. And what am I looking for? I'm looking for the Viridian. It looks very dull. It's not very high staining. It's very low non-staining. You need to use an awful lot of Viridian to get at a very intense value to it. But it, it doesn't look like a very natural green for trees. When you see convenience mixtures like sap green, right? It's a combination of paints, right? It's actually using an orange pigment, 48, which is actually the pigment used in quinacridone burnt orange, pigment yellow, 150, and a pigment green, 7, which is actually the phthalo green blue shade. So all those pigments are being used in a mixture to create sap green. Now, sap green is an interesting one because it is generally a warm yellow leaning green that is slightly dull, not very high in chroma. And you can see that by the way it's positioned inside of this color map. It is closer towards the yellows, and it's not out here in the high chroma area, it's inside, a little bit dull. Another very common green is Hooker's green. And you can see from looking at this that it's also a combination of greens, yellows, and here's some of that pigment orange. Now the pigment orange in both of these is what's actually taking the green and dulling it down. So we've got our yellow that's bringing the green pigment, I believe this is a phthalo pigment as well, and bringing it, warmer from its cooler area. And then we have our pigment orange, it's actually bringing it in from being a high chroma, keeping it kind of warm-ish, and then bringing it inside and dulling it down. So the thing with both the Hooker's green and over here, the sap green, is because it's a convenience mixture, it's a recipe, and different paint makers will have a slightly different recipe. So Hooker's green from Daniel Smith might not necessarily look the same as Hooker's green by Winsor and Newton, or Hooker's green by M. Graham or Holbein, or insert paint maker name here. Same goes for the sap green. So it's very difficult when you get maybe a supply list for a class or whatnot, and you see sap green on it. It's not, for me, good enough to just to go, oh, sap green, I'll go get a sap green. I generally want to know, well, which one. That would be the question I would want to know, because they can be quite different. I've encountered sap greens and have washed them out, and I just don't like them at all. But other ones I have seen are quite lovely. So be wary of that. And then we have, closer into the center of the wheel, we've got some other greens like chromium green oxide. Now, this is a single pigment green, PG17, but it's not one that I would generally consider because A, it's granulating, and B, it's actually quite opaque. Very dark in mass tone, and you can just see how right in there it can be very opaque, almost giving a little bit of a chalky, milky type feel in washes. It's not one I've played with, and it's never really suited my tastes personally. So for greens, whatever you use, you want to be thinking about the fact, you want to be aware of what the chroma is if it's really bright. And you want to be thinking that, it might be fine to have a nice bright green. I tend to prefer, high chroma pigments in my palette. But you need to know that they're that so that you would need to adjust it. So let's take a look at whole whack of greens. Glad I reset the page here. I was a little nervous to do that because I didn't want to lose this. So here's a whole bunch of greens. Some of them we've just spoken about. And I'm going to start all the way over here on this side. We've got green gold, and then here's our sap green I was just talking about. The phthalo yellow green diopside. Here's the hooker's green I was just talking about. So green gold is a very lovely yellow green. I used to use it a lot. It's a very interesting pigment. It's quite active. Tends to do some very surprising things. But lately, it's not one that I use much anymore. Serpentine Genuine and Green Apatite Genuine. Now, these are interesting. You see down here for pigment, it lists literally the material because that's what it is. These are part of the Primatech series of paints that Daniel Smith makes, which are all natural minerals ground up, and they create paints with them. Now, while they are very lovely, and either one of these could be an interesting substitute for sap green, there is, a flocculation in the paint that, it may be to your tastes, it may not be to your tastes. Some people absolutely love these paints, and, some prefer something a little bit more flat, less granulating. I tend to, as much as I have used these and I have loved them, lately I'm more in the non-granulating camp. But they are quite beautiful. And then, yeah, here's our sap green. Now, another interesting convenience mixture that Daniel Smith has, and a very useful one at that, is undersea green. Now, if you're just going to keep a little urban sketching green for dealing with natural foliage and things like that, undersea green's pretty good for landscapes. And that is because when you look at it against sap green, and to some extent hooker's green as well, the dullness of undersea green is more natural. It's not too bright or comical looking. That is the main reason. So once you really understand that, in taking a brighter color and bringing it down, it starts to open up a world of possibilities with higher chroma paints. You just know that you're going to need to make a little adjustment. And once you make that adjustment a few times, it gets to be pretty straightforward. You just need to be aware of the fact that you're going to need to do it, as opposed to putting a high chroma pigment down on your paper, looking at it and going, why does that look wrong? So one of the paints that I now use as a result of this understanding is I use this here, phthalo yellow green. Now it's a combination of phthalo green yellow shade and a little additional yellow, but it is very lovely, and I can get real bright greens with it, but I can also tone it down a little bit, and I can have it look like a green gold, or I can take it right in and with a combination of some ultramarine blue and a little bit of maybe an earth orange. I can take and create something that looks like an undersea green or a sap green. I can do all sorts of things with it. It's really, really quite flexible. Moving around the color wheel, we're kind of heading in towards, middle greens. So diopside, permanent green, Hooker's green. Okay. So these are, diopside green is one that I was using previously, but it does have a fair bit of granulation to it. And as a result, lately I have been going right in the middle here and using permanent green. Now it's a convenience mixture of phthalo green blue shade and a little bit of yellow, but it's quite staining, but it is non-granulating and transparent. So it washes out really nice and smooth and mixes quite well. So I really do quite like this. So I have a very yellow leaning green in the phthalo yellow green. And then I have a kind of a middle green in the permanent green. And those are the choices that I've made, right? So, rather than having a Hooker's or a sap, I go with the higher chroma ones, knowing that if I want I'm going to be using them for a landscape, for a tree or whatnot, that I'm going to need to adjust them. But it's quicker for me to take, say, an earth orange, add it to a green and bring it down, than it is for me to take a yellow and a blue, mix it to a green, and then take a look at that green and then decide whether it needs to be, toned down as well. Just for expediency's sake, I find having some convenience greens is a little bit quicker. So here we have phthalo green yellow shade. It is also very lovely, very popular pigment. Well, not as popular as, say, its bluer version, phthalo green blue shade, sometimes called Winsor green if it's by Winsor & Newton. This is a much higher saturated version of Viridian. So, and it's also a non-granulating hue option to Viridian. So if you're thinking traditional palette, a traditional palette single pigment green, be hard to argue with Viridian's presence in the palette, because it is that it's quite traditional. But I find it's like using student grade paint to some extent. You really got to work at it to get enough into a mixture to have it strong enough. At least that's been my experience. Maybe I've been using the wrong Viridian. If I am wrong, if there is one out there that is really nice and saturated, then do leave a comment below and let me know who makes it, because I would love to try it out. And another interesting green, it doesn't look so to the blue as the phthalo green blue shade here, but it does actually wash out a little bit bluer, is this Jadeite Genuine. This is similar to the Serpentine and the Green Apatite that I was showing earlier. This is part of their Primatech series. It is granulating, but this is a really, really lovely blue leaning green by Daniel Smith. So, but the phthalo green blue shade is the stronger, because it's the phthalo green. It's also on the more inexpensive side. Viridian will be a little bit more expensive, and Jadeite's actually a step up from there as well. I think it's closer to one of their more expensive pigments. So you're looking for something that's very versatile and budget friendly. Either of your phthalos are going to be pretty friendly options, with phthalo green blue shade probably getting the nod there. And then if we're going to go a little bit closer towards blue right on the outside, is a really lovely pigment, ultramarine turquoise. So this really gets us to the blue. And yeah, this is a very popular color right now. So in fashion, I see this hue showing up all over the place. But yeah, ultramarine turquoise is another option. So if I was just gonna say, add a green to as small a palette as possible, I would probably add something like Hooker's Green if I was just getting started. Then alternately, I would go to Permanent Green, just for my personal tastes. And I would have to do some digging around because I'm going to get this from Daniel Smith. Hooker's Green, you can get a lot of options from a bunch of different paint makers. Cotman's, Student Grade, they're all going to be pretty decent. But Permanent Green would be more where I would head to if I was going to step up from Hooker's Green. And then once I'm going from, say, 1 to something like this, I'm going to be adding some pears. And to it, I use the Permanent Green with a phthalo yellow green. And then I also have in my palette the ultramarine turquoise. So I hope that helps out. Some information about greens here. As you can see, there's a lot of them. There we go. There they all are again. But you don't need to have greens in your palette. You can mix them with your yellows and your blues. You can use your earth yellows. You can mix them with your yellows and your blues. You can dull them down with some earth oranges. There's really a lot of possibilities out there. But once you kind of know your workflow and you know what sort of colors you go after, you know what your subject matter is most of the time, adding in, a green or two into your palette can be a big time saver, especially when you are painting plein air and trying to react to things quickly. I paint a lot of birds, and I do encounter, in my paintings, birds that have a variety of different greens in them too. So I do find that especially having some of the higher chroma greens does make it a lot easier for me to get the greens that I'm after when it comes to that type of subject matter. So again, knowing what you're going to paint. I mean, if you're just going to paint, black and white watercolor paintings, you probably never need to add a green to your palette in your life. Or if you're just doing kind of very, moody, tonal paintings, it might not be something that you need either. But if you're doing a lot of landscapes, good chance you're going to need to put a green in there at some point. But nevertheless, thanks for tuning in. I was going to do a singular episode on secondaries because I did one on the primaries, but green is one that kind of throws people a lot, and it can be a difficult color to get right. So I felt it was important to really talk about them a little bit and show you a whole bunch of the different options out there. But again, the main thing to take into consideration when you're using whatever green it is that you choose to put in your perfect palette is that you are aware of how it looks on its own and what you're going to need to do with it to make it look more natural. So start looking at some photographs, start looking at some images of some trees, and start doing a little bit of color matching on some practice paper and really start understanding what color greens out there actually are and how you can use your paints to try to get close, or at least how it feels to you. So thanks for tuning in. Until next time, happy painting. If you enjoyed this video, please do like it. And if you have any questions or comments, do leave those below. Happy painting. Bye.